Elsewhere, Rick collapsed onto the ground completely exhausted, his body barely able to move as he thought he was about to die. The warriors around him looked down at him with approval after everything he had endured over the past 2 years. One of them admitted that Rick had done well surviving their brutal training, while another pointed out that Rick was probably the only person in their entire world capable of enduring something that extreme. Because of that, they assured him that the E-rank exam was nothing to worry about. What Rick should really worry about was whether he might accidentally destroy the entire testing ground instead. However, despite hearing that praise, Rick could barely even lift himself up. He still believed he had a long way to go before he could ever catch up to his masters. 12 years later, Rick finally arrived at the Adventurer E-rank promotion exam. He stepped inside the guild, where a beautiful receptionist welcomed him and politely asked to see his guild registration card. But the moment she looked at him closely, her expression suddenly changed in surprise. She immediately recognized him, while Rick stood there completely confused by her reaction. The woman called out Rick's name and even referred to him as Senpai. She quickly introduced herself as Arisa. After hearing her name, Rick finally recognized her as well, and he asked if she had been transferred to Central. Arisa admitted that she had been shocked when Rick suddenly quit in the past. However, hearing that he had become an adventurer surprised her even more. Meanwhile, Rick quietly looked around the testing grounds. What stood out to him immediately was the age gap. There was practically nobody else around his age. Almost every applicant there was still a teenager. Rick reflected on how ridiculous it probably looked for a 32-year-old F-rank adventurer to be taking the E-rank promotion exam. In the adventurer world, most people started before turning 20, and within only 2 years, they usually reached E-rank already. Someone like Rick was incredibly rare. Arisa agreed with his observation, but then, out of nowhere, a drunk middle-aged man suddenly approached and casually asked Arisa if she had any plans later. The moment Rick saw the man, he unexpectedly felt relieved. For the first time since arriving, there was finally another middle-aged applicant besides him. Arisa firmly told the drunk man that she was unavailable because she was currently working. However, instead of backing off, the man immediately became irritated and insisted that she should stop refusing because she would definitely have fun with him. Arisa raised her voice and told him that he was causing trouble. But then, the man grew even angrier. He suddenly grabbed Arisa by the hand and aggressively told her to stay quiet, insisting that women should simply obey and follow along. That was when Rick stepped forward. Without hesitation, he calmly removed the drunk man's hand from Arisa. The man instantly snapped at Rick and demanded to know what he thought he was doing. As the man kept yelling, Rick instinctively covered his nose from the overwhelming smell of alcohol coming off him. He could not believe that someone this drunk had shown up to take the exam in the first place. Still, Rick tried to calm the situation down. After all, he had worked as a guild clerk for 14 years. He had dealt with all kinds of difficult people before, so he believed he could settle this peacefully as well. Rick calmly told the drunk man to relax. However, the man suddenly lashed out and threw a punch at him, calling him annoying and telling him to die. At that moment, Rick realized the man was far too drunk to listen to reason anymore. The punch coming toward him felt unbelievably slow. In fact, compared to the attacks Rick had endured during the past 2 years of training, he felt like he could have been hit 92 times before this single punch even reached him. Before the attack could touch his face, Rick effortlessly dodged to the side. And almost instinctively, his body reacted on its own. In the same instant, he delivered a counterpunch straight into the man's body. The moment his fist connected, Rick immediately realized something was wrong. His hand had moved automatically after the dodge. Panic instantly hit him because if this turned into a real fight, he might lose his chance to take the exam entirely. However, with only that single punch, the drunk man collapsed to the ground. Rick stared in complete shock. To him, that attack had barely felt like a light push. Yet the man had gone down instantly from it. Rick quickly turned toward Arisa and asked if she was all right. Arisa happily assured him that she was fine while thanking him, and she admitted that he was incredibly strong. However, Rick casually brushed it off and claimed that the man was simply too weak. To Rick, the punch earlier had been slow and weak from the start. But then Arisa pointed out something that surprised him even more. She admitted that she had not even been able to see Rick's punch at all. After everything settled down, they returned to the registration process. Rick asked if all the formalities were complete, and Arisa handed his registration card back to him. Then she gave Rick his admission ticket for the exam. However, the moment Rick looked at the number written on it, his expression stiffened slightly. His exam number was 4242, and for some reason, it gave him an ominous feeling, even while Arisa encouraged him to do his best. Still, there was nothing he could do about it now. Rick simply accepted the ticket and prepared to leave. But before walking away, he glanced back at the drunk man lying there and quietly thought about how weak he really was. Just as Rick expected, that was probably the level of most F-rank adventurers around their age. On his way to the testing grounds, Rick was suddenly approached by a woman who asked if he had already finished registering. Her name was Lynette. Rick immediately found her cute. For a brief moment, he even thought that if he were 10 years younger, he probably would have tried asking her out. And compared to Arisa, there were certain features that stood out even more. However, Lynette quickly noticed the direction of Rick's gaze and awkwardly questioned what exactly he was thinking while staring at her chest like that. Before Rick could properly react, Lynette hurried the conversation along and explained that they should get moving because everybody was planning to come watch the exam. That only left Rick confused. He could not understand why so many people would gather just for this. As the two continued walking toward the exam site, Lynette noticed the complicated look on Rick's face and asked what was bothering him. Rick admitted that he was happy people wanted to cheer him on. However, he also pointed out that the people coming to support him had a strange habit of attracting trouble wherever they went, and everything around them usually ended up getting dragged into it as well. Meanwhile, as they passed by groups of young applicants, Rick suddenly let out a sigh and stopped walking for a moment. He explained to Lynette that seeing all these young adventurers made him lose confidence in himself. Every single one of them seemed to shine with potential. They all carried that youthful feeling of believing they could become anything in the world. Lynette immediately questioned why Rick would think like that. From her perspective, Rick's growth over the past 2 years had been unbelievable. Ever since becoming an adventurer, his strength and abilities had improved at an absurd rate. In fact, Lynette admitted she was more worried about the opposite problem. She believed that once the other examinees saw Rick's true strength, they would lose confidence in themselves instead. Because of that, she asked Rick to make sure he restrained himself during the exam. Hearing Lynette's warning immediately reminded Rick of something his senpais used to tell him all the time. Because of that, Rick finally started realizing that he might actually be fairly strong himself. However, there was still one major problem. For the past 2 years, he had spent almost all his time isolated deep in the mountains while training. Even before that, during his years as a clerk, he had mostly stayed inside the guild. In other words, Rick had never truly seen how strong the average adventurer actually was. Because of that, Rick decided to ask Lynette about the power levels between each adventurer rank and whether things still worked the same way as they did back when he was a clerk. Lynette carefully began explaining the ranking system to him. In F rank, adventurers were still considered beginners who were learning the basics, so even fighting low-level monsters could still be dangerous for them. Then came E rank, where adventurers were officially recognized as professionals. However, even at that level, low-rank monsters could still pose a difficult challenge. After that was D rank, which Lynette described as a strange special rank that most adventurers barely stayed in before eventually moving up to C rank. At the C rank level, adventurers could easily handle low-rank monsters, but high-rank monsters would still give them serious trouble. B-rank adventurers, on the other hand, were strong enough to comfortably defeat high-rank monsters alone. And finally, E-rank adventurers stood at an entirely different level altogether. They could easily wipe out entire hordes of high-rank monsters by themselves. After hearing the full explanation, Rick quietly organized the information in his head. The ranking system seemed fairly straightforward. Based on those standards, he felt like he should definitely be strong enough for E-rank already. However, simply hearing about it still made it difficult for him to fully imagine where he truly stood. Lynette noticed his uncertainty and encouraged him to have more confidence in himself. She reminded Rick that he was a member of the legendary party known as the strongest on the continent, the Orichalcum Fist. Rick simply smiled after hearing that. Then he admitted that since he had already been accepted as one of their comrades, he at least needed to become an E-rank adventurer. At the very least, he wanted to reach a point where even a single adventurer could properly recognize him. Because of that, he promised himself that he would give everything he had during the exam. Meanwhile, back at the front desk, Arisa called for the guards and instructed them to take the drunk man away. One of the guards asked Arisa if she was alright after hearing that the drunk man had caused trouble and tried to pick a fight with her. Arisa reassured them that she was fine and explained that an acquaintance of hers had stepped in and saved her. The guards moved closer to inspect the unconscious drunk man more carefully. However, the moment they looked at his body armor, their expressions immediately changed. Right in the center of the steel armor was a massive dent shaped perfectly like a human fist. The guards quickly realized that this was no ordinary attack. One of them carefully examined the damage and questioned Arisa about what kind of strength Rick had used to create something like that with a single punch. Then the guard revealed the drunk man's identity. He explained that the man was a wanted criminal involved in multiple cases of battery and was once known as the former A-rank adventurer called the Knight of Tyranny, Damarudo. Arisa stood there completely stunned after hearing that. However, when the guard asked who exactly this acquaintance of hers was, she explained that Rick used to work at the guild reception desk 2 years ago. To Arisa, Rick had always seemed like nothing more than an ordinary middle-aged clerk. She never remembered him using any incredible magic or martial arts techniques. Because of that, even the guards struggled to believe what they were hearing. Somehow, in only 2 years, a normal middle-aged clerk had become strong enough to defeat a former A-rank adventurer with a single blow. Meanwhile, Rick had already finished the body examination. Afterward, he asked Lynette what the next part of the test would be. Lynette explained that the next stage was an attack power measurement exam. She handed Rick a paper containing all the details for the E-rank promotion exam and told him to confirm the schedule for the remaining tests. Later on, with Lynette guiding him, Rick arrived at the next examination site. As they entered the room, Rick lined up together with the other applicants. Including him, there were 6 participants in total. The staff member overseeing the exam began explaining the rules. Their target would be a slime bag created from processed slime materials wrapped tightly in leather. The bag specialized in absorbing impacts, making it ideal for testing magic and martial arts attacks safely. Each applicant would strike the slime bag once, and their score would be determined based on the strength of their attack. The moment Rick heard that explanation, he immediately became uneasy. He recognized those slime bags instantly because he had used them constantly during his training. That memory quickly brought him back to one of his master's lessons. His master once told him that regardless of the weapon or magic someone used, the true foundation of strength was always the body itself. According to him, the moment Rick could destroy a gold slime bag with only his bare fists, he would finally have a body he could fully trust. However, to Rick, that idea still sounded absurd even now. To him, a slime bag was something that could never possibly break from a punch. It was sturdy enough to withstand attacks capable of crushing castle walls like butter, including the bite force of a dragon's tooth. Rick's master immediately denied that such a thing was impossible. Then, to prove it, his master casually declared that he could destroy 200 slime bags at once. In the next instant, he demonstrated it with a single punch. The moment Rick witnessed that monstrous display of strength, he immediately turned around and ran for his life. However, his master chased after him while loudly insisting that Rick could do the same thing too if he simply hit the bags 50,000 times every single day. Just remembering that training made Rick's face go pale. Memories flooded back into his mind of his master relentlessly chasing him through the mountains while forcing him to continue punching those slime bags without rest. Rick honestly felt grateful that his body had somehow adapted enough to pour tremendous power into his fists and pierce through objects that thick. At the same time, he also felt like apologizing to whoever created those training methods in the first place. Back in the present, Rick carefully looked at the slime bag prepared for the exam. This one was green, meaning it was the weakest type available. Among slime bags, gold ranked at the very top, while green sat at the absolute bottom. The examiner then began calling the participants one by one. The first name announced was applicant number 4237, Frito Diramato. Frito confidently stepped forward toward the slime bag, proudly declaring that this was finally his chance to display his true power. Immediately, murmurs spread among the other applicants. Many of them recognized him as the second son of the Diramato family. Rumors claimed that despite being only 11 years old, his magical ability had already reached the level of a C-rank adventurer. There were even stories saying that the Mage Party Fairy Rondo had offered an enormous amount of money just to scout him. Rick quietly listened to all the whispers around him. He could not help being amazed that an 11-year-old child was already being called a prodigy with achievements and expectations like that. Rick even started wondering whether Frito was some kind of celebrity. Still, Rick reminded himself that there was no point getting jealous of the talent of the younger generation anymore. He was already far too old for that kind of thinking. However, from Rick's perspective, this situation was actually perfect. By watching Frito's attack first, he could use it as a reference to figure out how much strength he should use during his own turn. As Frito stood in front of the slime bag, he slowly gathered magical power into his hand while chanting a spell. He called forth a heat comparable to the flames of hell itself and invoked the power of sweltering heat through third-order binding magic. The moment Rick heard the spell, he became genuinely impressed. Using third-order binding magic at such a young age was already extraordinary. Even for many C-rank adventurers, that level of magic was considered extremely difficult to master. For Rick, the moment he saw the sweltering heat magic being prepared, memories of his brutal magic training immediately came rushing back. He still remembered one important lesson from those days. Whenever that kind of magic was about to be cast, getting too close to it was a very bad idea. Back then, Rick's master explained that if magical power was controlled perfectly, entirely new magic could be created from it. Rick vividly remembered the moment his master successfully cast the spell and became fascinated by the strange cloud of smoke it produced because it looked exactly like a giant mushroom. However, the instant Rick saw that scene, he immediately turned around and ran away as fast as he could. Meanwhile, his master simply questioned why he kept running away. He genuinely thought he was about to die. During those years of training, Rick constantly lived with fear hanging over him. He repeatedly begged his master not to kill him during training sessions. However, looking back at it now, he could only feel grateful for surviving all of it. If he had not learned how to protect himself back then, there was no way he would even be standing here taking the exam today. Because of that, Rick could not help comparing Frito to his own master. In Rick's eyes, his master had also been a complete genius. That was exactly why he became worried. If Frito unleashed magic on the same level as his master inside a sealed room like this, then everyone there would be in serious danger. At that moment, Frito finished chanting the spell and activated Flame Eliminate. However, instead of a massive inferno, only a tiny fireball appeared from his hand. Rick stared at it in complete shock. The fireball was unbelievably small. In Rick's mind, he immediately compared it to the same spell his master used during training, except his master's version had been at least 100 times larger. Because of that comparison, Rick started thinking that maybe this so-called prodigy had taken shortcuts while learning the spell. Still, Rick did not completely lose faith in the boy. Instead, he considered another possibility. Maybe Frito had compressed an enormous amount of magical energy into that tiny fireball. If that 100 times larger magic had truly been condensed into something that small, then the spell would actually possess terrifying destructive power. However, the next moment shattered Rick's expectations completely. The fireball struck the slime bag and exploded immediately, causing the bag to wobble only slightly. Rick stood there utterly disappointed. Meanwhile, everyone else around him burst into excitement and praised the attack as exactly what they expected from a prodigy. Frito himself proudly apologized while claiming he had simply made a minor mistake with his control. The other applicants stared at him in admiration. However, Rick was the only one left standing there feeling deeply disappointed, quietly thinking that the performance had been far too shabby for someone called a prodigy. The other examinees immediately agreed with the crowd's reaction. To them, Frito was clearly a genius. After that, the remaining applicants stepped forward one after another and began showing off their own abilities against the slime bag. Meanwhile, Rick quietly continued watching from the side, completely unaware that one of the examiners had already noticed the strengthening magic flowing through his body. As Rick observed the attacks carefully, confusion slowly started building in his mind. None of the other 4 applicants could even properly move the slime bag. At that point, Rick honestly started wondering if the entire test was some kind of prank. At the same time, it made him realize once again just how abnormal the training his masters forced him through really was. Eventually, the examiner finally called out applicant number 4242, Rick Gladiartle. However, even while walking to the front, he was still struggling to decide how much strength he should actually use. His masters had repeatedly warned him to hold back, and Lynette had told him the exact same thing. But for opponents and targets at this level, Rick honestly had no idea what holding back was supposed to mean anymore. As he walked across the room, whispers immediately spread among the applicants and spectators. Some mocked how old he was for someone still trying to break into E rank. Others quietly laughed at him. Some younger applicants even used him as an example of what they did not want to become in the future. There were also people saying that the world simply had 2 kinds of people, those who could succeed and those who never would. Through all of it, Rick remained completely calm. Once he reached the front, the examiner questioned him directly about his profile. The examiner asked if it was really true that Rick only started being an adventurer at the age of 30. Rick calmly confirmed that it was true. The examiner then bluntly explained that magical potential was something that needed to be trained before the age of 20. According to him, after that point, people could no longer expect any meaningful growth. He also pointed out that Rick's measured magical power was terrible. Although he claimed he was not trying to insult him, the examiner still advised Rick to quickly start searching for another career if he failed the exam. In the end, the man openly insisted that Rick should simply give up already. Rick could clearly feel the stares around him. He recognized those kinds of eyes immediately. They were the same looks people gave when they pitied someone. Hearing all of that honestly hurt him. Still, Rick quietly reminded himself that the reason his magical powers seemed low was because he had started too late. Deep down, he also understood that the examiner's words were not entirely unfair. At that moment, memories of his brutal training resurfaced once again. He remembered the countless days of suffering when his master told him he was still only halfway through training and asked whether they should stop there. However, Rick had refused immediately and insisted that he could still continue. He already knew he had started later than everyone else, which was exactly why he could never allow himself to stop halfway. As Rick stood in front of the slime bag, determination slowly filled his eyes. In his heart, he questioned why it should matter what age someone started being an adventurer, or what age they decided to start something new in life. Then Rick steadied himself in front of the target and quietly reassured himself that everything would be fine. He was calm now. And this time, he would make sure to hold back properly. Before Rick began his turn, he suddenly called out to the examiner who had been mocking him earlier. Rick addressed him as the esteemed examiner who loved looking down on others. Then Rick calmly questioned him. He asked whether a middle-aged man who started late and possessed the worst magical capacity would automatically fail if he deliberately held back his strength. Rick continued speaking while tightening his fist. He pointed out that if failing because of that meant he should give up being an adventurer, then maybe he really should hurry up and start searching for some age-appropriate job instead. Then Rick slowly positioned himself in front of the slime bag. In the next instant, he unleashed a straight punch toward the target. However, the moment his fist reached the slime bag, the entire thing exploded violently. Debris scattered across the entire room as the shockwave blasted through the testing site. The force behind Rick's punch was so overwhelming that it even tore a massive hole through the wall behind the target. The entire room instantly fell silent. The examiner, the other applicants, and even Frito stood frozen in complete shock. None of them could move at all as they struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Rick himself stared at the destroyed slime bag in disbelief. He genuinely could not understand why the green slime bag had failed to absorb the impact of his punch. In Rick's mind, the stronger slime bags used during his training would never have broken from an attack like that. Rick slowly looked down at his own hand. And at that moment he finally realized something important. During the past 2 years, his masters had taught him countless things. They trained his body, sharpened his instincts, and pushed him far beyond normal limits. However, there was one thing they had never taught him at all. Nobody had ever taught Rick how to properly hold back. Later, Rick moved on to the written exam. However, once the results came out, he ended up getting a perfect score. He casually reminded everyone not to underestimate a former clerk like him. Meanwhile, Lynette pointed out that he had worked that job for 14 long years. At the same time, Frito watched Rick from a distance with growing irritation. In his mind, that 40-year-old commoner had already gotten in his way twice. However, Frito quickly convinced himself that things would be different now. Rick clearly specialized in physical attacks, while Frito himself excelled in defense magic. Since the next test focused on defensive power, Frito grinned confidently, certain that this would finally be the moment he could show Rick the gap between them. But then the defense power measurement exam began, and Frito's confidence immediately started to crack, even against a fourth-order spell that he himself could not completely block. Later, Rick stepped forward to face his opponent for the next phase of the exam. However, the moment the man prepared for the test, he immediately warned Rick that they would now be moving up to fifth-order spells. Because of that, he strongly recommended that Rick use a higher-level defensive spell for safety. However, Rick calmly told him not to worry. He admitted that it was honestly a little embarrassing, but for both attack and defense magic, he could only use a single first-order spell each. The opponent froze in disbelief. Rick's precise control over magic was already unbelievable enough, and hearing that he only knew first-order spells made even less sense. The man tried to explain that the next spell would naturally be on a completely different level, and that a first-order defense spell would never be enough. But before he could finish, Rick once again insisted that there was no need to hold back. He told the man to fire the spell without restraint. Because of that determination, the examiner finally accepted it and warned Rick not to regret what was about to happen. The man then began his chant. He called upon the saints who admired the castle walls and the soldiers who clung to them, summoning the wave of destruction rushing through the southwestern gate. As the chant continued, magic gathered violently around his hands. A massive sphere of compressed wind slowly formed, overflowing with destructive power. The commentator and the other applicants could only stare in shock. None of them could believe the overwhelming power of the spell that had just been unleashed. Everyone watching was left completely stunned by the sight of a fully chanted fifth-order spell. One of the applicants immediately insisted that something like that should never be fired during an E-rank exam. However, another applicant replied that a spell on that level was not something people casually used even in higher-ranked battles. Then, with a powerful thrust of his hand toward Rick, the spell exploded forward. A violent cyclone tore across the battlefield as the man unleashed the fifth-order spell, Shock Cyclone. Meanwhile, Rick simply stood there calmly, waiting for the perfect moment. Frito, who had been watching the entire exchange, could only stare in disbelief at what was unfolding before him. Then the Shock Cyclone finally disappeared. However, once the violent winds faded away, the battlefield itself had been completely devastated. The ground was torn apart from the overwhelming force of the spell. At that moment, one of the kingdom's knights arrived at the scene. He casually remarked that he thought the exam should have ended long ago. However, he quickly noticed the strange atmosphere around him. Every applicant was standing stiff and speechless, as if they had just witnessed something impossible. A woman then called out to the knight, addressing him as Sylvester. She questioned why a first-rank knight from the kingdom's chivalric order would personally come to a place like this. Sylvester explained that he had been deployed there as the commanding officer for the exam's defense unit. However, he immediately shifted the conversation toward the far more important matter. He asked her what exactly had happened there. As the details were explained, Sylvester's expression slowly changed. He learned that an F-rank adventurer had destroyed the green slime bag, the wall, and even the barrier itself with nothing more than a bare-handed punch. On top of that, The same man had supposedly defended himself against a second-class wizard's fully chanted 5th order spell using only a 1st order spell. Sylvester could barely process what he was hearing. He even questioned whether this entire situation was supposed to be some kind of popular joke spreading around the guild. However, the woman immediately denied it. She explained that this was neither a joke nor some ridiculous urban myth. Participant number 4242 truly existed. She then revealed that there had been several misunderstandings from the start. The slime bag Rick destroyed had not been made from the lowest grade green slimes alone. Instead, it had been a composite item created from mid-grade blue and yellow slimes as well. The spell unleashed by the wizard had also not been ordinary magic. It was a fully chanted 5th order spell. And the spell Rick used to defend himself against it had been nothing more than a no-chant 1st order spell. Hearing all of that left Sylvester genuinely shaken. He admitted that both feats sounded completely impossible. Even for someone like himself, a first-rank knight of the kingdom, accomplishing either one would be nearly unimaginable. Sylvester then asked to see the information for examinee number 4242. However, the moment he looked through Rick's registration papers, his shock deepened even further. Rick was already 32 years old. For an F-rank adventurer at that age to possess that kind of overwhelming power was completely insane. And as Sylvester stared at the documents in silence, he could not help but wonder what kind of life Rick had lived to become someone like this. As Sylvester continued reading through Rick's records, he actually rubbed his eyes to make sure he was seeing things correctly. However, no matter how many times he looked, the information remained the same. Rick's entire work history consisted of nothing more than reception duties. For 14 years straight, he had worked as a receptionist handling clerical tasks. Sylvester could not understand it at all. He even asked the woman if receptionist was secretly some kind of title given to people who had subjugated dragons. However, the woman simply answered with a plain and immediate no. Meanwhile, outside the exam site, Rick was still trying to process everything that had happened. He was completely shocked that he apparently did not need to hold back during the first exam at all. However, Lynette quickly clarified the misunderstanding. When they warned him to hold back, they were specifically talking about the second exam, since his mock battle there would involve fighting another person directly. The moment Rick understood that, he let out a huge sense of relief. He realized he had been worrying over nothing the entire time. But then, out of nowhere, someone suddenly shouted at him, angrily calling him a commoner. It was Frito. Rick immediately remembered seeing him during the exam and recalled that he was supposedly some kind of prodigy. However, while Rick recognized the boy's face, he completely failed to remember his actual name. In his mind, he vaguely thought Frito's name probably started with the letter N. That instantly made Frito even angrier. He loudly insisted that there was not a single N anywhere in his name. He proudly declared himself to be the genius prodigy, Frito Diramuto. However, Rick completely misunderstood the situation. He quietly told Lynette that he always felt bad whenever a child got lost. Because of that, he suggested they help the boy look for his parents. Frito nearly exploded in rage after hearing that. He furiously demanded that Rick stop making fun of him. Frito then complained that he had plans to brilliantly display his genius during the previous exam. However, Rick had ruined everything by interfering with dirty tricks. The moment Rick noticed tears forming in Frito's eyes, he immediately panicked. He insisted that he had never used anything resembling dirty tricks at all. But then another voice suddenly interrupted them. A woman angrily shouted toward Rick, accusing him of having some nerve for making her little brother cry. Rick quickly realized that she must be Frito's older sister. The woman confirmed it herself and introduced her name as Angelica, the firstborn daughter of the Diramuto household. At the same time, Frito rushed over to Angelica while still crying dramatically. He complained that Rick, the old guy in his 40s, had bullied him. Rick immediately reacted the moment his age was mentioned. He loudly corrected them, insisting that he was still only around 30 years old. However, Angelica immediately focused on defending her little brother. Rick tried to explain that he had never bullied Frito in the first place, but Angelica instantly cut him off and ordered him to stay quiet. According to her, if her brother said it happened, then that was enough proof. She also added that Rick obviously looked around 40 years old anyway, and someone like that had to be evil. Rick desperately continued insisting that he was still in his 30s. However, Angelica completely ignored him and calmly removed her gloves instead. Then, without hesitation, Angelica threw the gloves directly at Rick and formally challenged him to a duel. Rick picked up the gloves and stared at them carefully. However, instead of focusing on the challenge itself, his attention drifted somewhere completely different. He pointed out that gloves only become that perfectly white after an incredible amount of washing. And while a noble lady like Angelica probably would not understand it, laundry work was absolutely awful. Lynette quickly pointed out to Rick that picking up the gloves meant he had officially accepted the duel challenge. However, Rick had absolutely no idea that was how it worked. Angelica immediately declared that since Rick had picked up the gloves, the duel was now official under the customs of the Philheme Kingdom. She explained that in a Philheme-style duel, both sides were allowed to declare one condition. Without hesitation, Angelica proudly announced her condition. The loser would serve the winner as their servant for the rest of their life. She then confidently introduced herself as a second-class knight of the kingdom's chivalric order and declared that Rick would soon receive proper punishment from her personally. However, even while speaking, she continued calling Rick a man in his 40s despite Rick repeatedly insisting that he was still around 30 years old. Later, the two of them arrived inside the duel arena. Angelica stood proudly as she declared that she would thoroughly discipline Rick during the duel itself. However, from Rick's perspective, the entire situation had become unnecessarily troublesome. In the first place, he only wanted to focus on passing the adventurer exam peacefully. As Rick observed Angelica more carefully, he pointed out that she was a second-class knight of the kingdom's chivalric order. Because of that, he wondered if she might actually be incredibly strong. Lynette then explained the structure of the kingdom's chivalric order. The organization was responsible for protecting and maintaining peace throughout the Philheme Kingdom. As for the rank of second-class knight, only first-class knights stood above them within the normal hierarchy. However, there was also one rank that existed outside the standard system entirely. A legendary title held by only 13 people in the entire kingdom. Those individuals were known as the Special Class Knights. And unlike the normal knight rankings, their title existed separately from the official hierarchy itself. Lynette then estimated Angelica's strength for Rick. A second-class knight would roughly be comparable to a B-rank adventurer. Because of that, she casually reassured Rick that there was not much for him to worry about against an opponent on that level. However, Rick immediately insisted that a B-rank level opponent was already more than strong enough to terrify him. Lynette then reminded Rick to make absolutely sure he held back properly during the duel. However, Rick looked genuinely confused by the idea of holding back at all. From his perspective, Angelica held a far higher social position than him. Meanwhile, he himself had only just become an F-rank adventurer. Lynette then asked Rick whether he was feeling nervous. Rick admitted that he was less worried about the duel itself and more worried about whether he would survive long enough to safely make it back home afterward. Hearing that, Lynette reminded him of the brutal training he had endured over the last 2 years. Rick smiled as memories of those 2 years suddenly resurfaced in his mind. However, almost immediately afterward, his expression completely broke down. The memories were so overwhelming that he became hysterical on the spot and desperately begged for someone to save him. Before the battle officially began, Lynette asked Rick how he was feeling. Rick honestly admitted that it felt like his spirit was completely crumbling apart. However, Lynette quickly pointed something out to him. Despite everything happening around him, Rick was no longer actually feeling stressed. Rick looked toward Lynette for a moment before quietly smiling back. In his mind, he realized she was right. Everyone at the exam had been shocked by the strength he displayed, and somewhere along the way, he had truly become strong in his own way. That realization slowly gave Rick confidence. He stood up and started walking toward Angelica. Before leaving, he casually mentioned that he would be going for a bit, while Lynette calmly told him to take care. Meanwhile, Angelica looked at Rick and asked if he was finally done preparing himself. Inside Rick's mind, he fully understood the situation he was stepping into. His opponent was a second-class knight of the kingdom. He had no idea what his own limits even were anymore. Because of that, he decided he would simply do everything he possibly could. Angelica then noticed that Rick's expression had changed compared to earlier. However, she still looked down on him completely. In the end, Rick was only an F-rank adventurer in her eyes. She confidently declared that she would hold back just enough to make sure he did not die during the duel. Rick quietly stood in place and observed her movements carefully. The moment Angelica revealed her sword stance, Rick immediately started analyzing her fighting style. He judged her as a swordsman who specialized in strengthening magic, the type that reinforced both the body and the weapon itself. Then the battle finally began. Angelica confidently wondered whether Rick could even keep up with her speed. The moment she declared her attack, she instantly rushed toward him. Using a technique known as blink step, she accelerated forward in a flash while Rick remained standing there completely unfazed. But then, in the very next instant, Rick was shocked by the sheer power of her strike. The attack completely sliced through the wall behind him. Just one swing of her sword had enough force to cut straight through solid stone. Rick could hardly believe what he had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Angelica coldly remarked that she had intentionally slowed down her opening attack as a form of greeting for an F-rank adventurer like him. However, judging by Rick's reaction, it still seemed far too fast for him to handle. Nearby, Frito watched the duel unfold while laughing proudly to himself. He mocked Rick as a 40-year-old peasant and boasted that his older sister was famously known as the Flash of Light, Angelica. According to Frito, Angelica's reputation came entirely from her overwhelming speed. At the same time, Angelica calmly pointed out that Rick looked completely shocked by her attack. She even noticed that he was so stunned that words would not come out of his mouth. However, she warned him that the next strike would not miss on purpose. Then Angelica immediately launched another attack. Using Blink Step once again, she rushed straight toward Rick while he simply remained standing there quietly. But then, from Rick's perspective, everything suddenly slowed down. As Angelica closed the distance between them, he carefully observed every movement she made. His eyes widened slightly as he watched her approach. For Rick, it was far too slow. In fact, compared to the speed he normally moved at himself, Angelica's attack felt unbelievably sluggish. He even questioned whether this was really the famous flash of light everyone kept talking about. However, Lynette suddenly called out to him from the side. That snapped Rick back to reality, and he quickly realized he still needed to dodge the attack properly. In the next instant, Rick effortlessly stepped aside, cleanly dodging Angelica's blink step. The momentum carried Angelica straight past him. Angelica immediately froze in disbelief. She could not believe that someone had actually dodged her technique. Even more unbelievable was the fact that Rick had seemed to perfectly see through all of her movements. To her, that simply should not have been possible. Inside Angelica's mind, she knew that only a small number of first-class knights could directly react to her speed. However, the same man she was fighting now had looked completely incapable of following her earlier attack just moments ago. Because of that, Angelica convinced herself that it had only been a lucky coincidence. Rick must have simply moved at the right moment by accident. She assured herself that there would not be another fluke like that again. Then she immediately rushed forward for another attack. However, the moment she accelerated, her foot suddenly caught on a loose rock. Angelica instantly realized her balance had been thrown off. Meanwhile, Rick stared at the situation in confusion. From his perspective, she looked incredibly slow. He even started questioning whether someone like this was truly a second-class knight. Rick honestly wondered if Angelica had only entered the chivalric order through noble connections. However, another possibility also crossed his mind. Maybe he himself had simply become unbelievably strong. Then Rick noticed it was finally time to dodge again. From his point of view, Angelica's stumble caused her attacks to turn into a spinning barrage of wild slashes. Rick looked visibly shocked while Angelica continued yelling as she launched the attack recklessly toward him. To Rick, it looked like Angelica was rotating her entire body to unleash a completely disordered series of sword strikes. He suddenly remembered all the martial arts training his masters had forced him through over the years. However, even with all of that experience, this was the very first time he had ever seen a technique like this. And because of that, Rick honestly wondered whether he would even be able to dodge all of it. However, as the chaotic attacks continued flying toward him, Rick smoothly avoided every single slash one after another. At the same time, doubt started creeping into his mind. He questioned whether he had become too full of himself for thinking he might actually be strong. Even if he truly had gained power, he convinced himself that it could only be at the level of an F-rank adventurer. After all, there would always be someone stronger. And in the end, he still considered himself nothing more than a complete beginner. To Rick, Angelica's movements were undeniably impressive. However, what stood out even more to him was how cunning her tactics truly were. He realized that she had intentionally been using only a fraction of the full speed of her blink step. Then, the moment her opponent relaxed their guard, she would suddenly move in for the killing blow. At that moment, Rick finally understood. This was the true strength of a second-class knight. Meanwhile, Angelica herself was thinking about the mistake she had made earlier. She had stumbled over the rock while carrying an enormous amount of momentum. However, from her perspective, it seemed like Rick had not even noticed what really happened. Angelica then focused her attention back on Rick. She pointed out that he had reacted to her movement earlier and directly responded to her charge. According to her, the last time someone had seen through her speed that clearly was during a battle against a special-class knight. However, Angelica quickly came to a conclusion. If Rick could currently follow her movements, then all she needed to do was move even faster until he no longer could. She then warned Rick to prepare himself. Starting now, she would use a high-speed technique that she could only activate 3 times per day. The burden it placed on her body was enormous. However, the speed itself was on an entirely different level from everything she had shown him so far. The moment she finished speaking, Angelica exploded forward once again with blink step. Rick immediately noticed the difference. This time, Angelica was moving roughly 3 times faster than before. However, even after seeing that increase in speed, Rick still felt the exact same thing. It was still slow. At that point, Rick honestly started wondering whether Angelica was even being serious with him at all. However, he immediately warned himself not to let his guard down. There was still a chance this entire thing was some kind of trap. In Rick's mind, if he attacked carelessly, Angelica would probably unleash some lethal counterattack the instant he committed himself. Rick became increasingly frustrated as the duel continued. At this rate, he felt like he was making absolutely no progress. Because of that, he decided on a new plan. He would carefully observe Angelica's movements one more time. Then, the next time she charged directly at him, he would greet her with a decisive, critical strike right from the start. Because of that decision, Rick calmly moved aside once again and effortlessly dodged Angelica's attack. The movement was so clean that Angelica flew right past him once more, almost like a bull charging past a matador. Angelica could hardly believe what was happening anymore. As she stared at Rick, doubt finally started creeping into her mind. She questioned who he really was and wondered whether he was truly just an F-rank adventurer. Someone at that level should never have been capable of dodging her attacks this consistently. At the same time, Angelica remembered the limitations of her technique. The high-speed move she called Rin could only be used 2 more times. For a brief moment, Angelica hesitated. She honestly did not know what she should do anymore or how she was supposed to win this duel. However, she immediately rejected those thoughts. To her, this situation did not require overthinking at all. If Rick could dodge her attacks one at a time, then she would simply overwhelm him by attacking continuously at her maximum speed. Even for Angelica, this was entering unknown territory. Then she immediately launched herself forward again, combining Blink Step together with Rin. Her speed exploded far beyond before as she rushed directly toward Rick. However, Rick once again avoided the attack cleanly. Angelica flew past him again, but this time she acknowledged it herself. As expected, Rick had managed to dodge it. Even so, Angelica refused to lose hope. Her body was already starting to suffer from the strain of repeatedly using the technique. However, despite the pain building up inside her muscles, she continued chaining together Blink Step and Rin while repeatedly charging toward Rick without stopping. Angelica relied purely on willpower as she continued her assault. She tightened her grip around her sword even harder, then once again rushed toward Rick at full force, determined to break through his defense no matter what. Rick, meanwhile, stayed completely focused the entire time. He refused to let his guard down for even a second because he had convinced himself that Angelica's Blink Step was only a setup. In his mind, her real lethal strike still had not appeared yet, and the moment she finally revealed it, he planned to counterattack immediately. However, just before Angelica could land her next strike on him, disaster struck once again. Her foot caught on another rock. The sudden loss of balance caused Angelica to slip and stumble forward unexpectedly. Rick was instantly shocked. For a brief moment, it even looked like Angelica had completely disappeared from his sight. However, he quickly realized that she had not vanished at all. She had fallen lower beneath his line of vision while slipping across the ground. Meanwhile, Angelica continued sliding below Rick after tripping over the stone. Her body was already collapsing toward the ground. At that moment, Rick became convinced that Angelica had somehow read through his attack. He had already prepared to strike directly in front of him, yet she suddenly dropped beneath that attack path entirely. Rick grew frustrated. He wondered whether he could still adjust in time if he attacked downward instead. Then, in the very next instant, Rick made his decision. Instead of striking Angelica directly, he drove his fist straight into the ground itself. The impact instantly exploded through the arena floor. The ground shattered violently from the force of the punch, and the shockwave launched Angelica away as debris burst everywhere around them. After surviving the devastating attack, Angelica sat nearby in complete shock. She immediately realized something terrifying. If she had not accidentally tripped over that stone, Rick's punch would have hit her directly and completely destroyed her. Meanwhile, Rick calmly looked toward her and concluded that she had dodged the attack exactly as expected from a second-class knight. Angelica, however, was visibly shaken now. Fear had clearly appeared on her face as she demanded to know who Rick really was. Rick casually explained that he was simply someone who decided to turn over a new leaf 2 years ago. Since then, he had gone from working as a guild receptionist to recently becoming an F-rank adventurer. Angelica immediately rejected that explanation completely. To her, there was no way that story could possibly be true. However, Rick calmly continued. He explained that people had warned him to hold back whenever fighting against other people. But against someone as highly ranked as Angelica, he honestly felt there was no chance he could afford to do something like that. Then Rick spoke with complete determination. He declared that he intended to use this opportunity to practice against a truly skilled opponent. And because of that, he planned to fight seriously from this point onward. The moment Angelica heard that, she immediately raised both of her hands in surrender. Rick stood there completely confused after hearing Angelica surrender. From his perspective, she had been the one dominating the duel the entire time. Because of that, he honestly could not understand why she would suddenly admit defeat. Meanwhile, Angelica was trembling badly. Tears had already started forming in her eyes as she finally admitted her loss. However, Rick remained genuinely confused and immediately questioned why she had given up. But then, instead of answering him properly, Angelica suddenly turned and ran at full speed. At that moment, Rick suddenly remembered the condition Angelica herself had declared before the duel began. The loser would have to serve the winner for the rest of their life. Because of that, Rick quickly called out to her. He pointed out that he had never even stated his own condition during the duel. However, at the very least, he expected Angelica to properly honor the condition she herself proposed. The moment she heard that, Angelica immediately raised her voice in panic. She loudly declared that she would once again surpass her limits. Then, without hesitation, she activated the combination of Rin and Blink Step once more and dashed away from the arena at unbelievable speed. Rick quietly observed her disappearing figure and concluded that it was probably the fastest speed she had shown the entire day. However, instead of understanding what was happening, Rick only became more confused. He honestly wondered whether Angelica had suddenly started feeling sick for some reason. Later, Rick and Lynette headed toward the next location for the exam. Along the way, Rick asked whether he had successfully passed the earlier stages. However, Lynette answered in a surprisingly calm way. If Rick passed, then that was good, but even if he failed, they would simply increase his training intensity by 3 times anyway. According to her, that outcome would still be beneficial for him in the end. The moment Rick heard that, he immediately complained that kind of training would absolutely kill him. But then, out of nowhere, another voice suddenly interrupted them. Someone loudly called out to Lynette, referring to her as a beautiful dark elf. A man soon approached them and politely stated that there was something he wanted to ask her. Because of that, he questioned whether Lynette currently had any free time available. However, Lynette immediately declined. She calmly explained that she already needed to head somewhere else afterward. The man then realized he had not properly introduced himself yet. He began introducing his identity with complete confidence. His name was Lastar Duramudo, the firstborn son of the Duke's family that governed the nobles of the northern region. After introducing himself, Lastar politely asked Lynette for her name. Once Lynette answered him, Lastar immediately commented that even her name itself was beautiful. Then Lastar suddenly changed the topic. He casually mentioned that he had apparently dropped something valuable earlier. After that, he asked whether Lynette was interested in hearing about the thing he had lost. Lynette immediately answered him with a simple and direct no. However, Lastar completely ignored her actual response and simply decided that she was interested anyway. Because of that, he confidently announced that he would now tell her about it. Lastar suddenly reached out and held Lynette's hand. Then, with complete confidence, he romantically explained that he had dropped his feelings of love into the depths of her eyes before giving her a dramatic wink. However, Lynette could only wonder what exactly was wrong with this guy. Meanwhile, Lastar continued speaking smoothly. After the exam ended, he wanted Lynette to come with him to the northern region. More specifically, he wanted her to become his second wife. Lynette silently stared at the way Lastar continued rubbing her hand. At the same time, Rick stood there completely shocked after hearing such a sudden request. Because of that, Rick immediately stepped forward and told Lastar to calm down. Then, in the middle of the moment, Rick suddenly lied and claimed that Lynette was actually his girlfriend. According to him, he could not just stay silent while another man openly flirted with his girl right in front of him. However, the moment the words left his mouth, Rick immediately realized how dangerous that situation had become. In his mind, he was convinced Lynette probably hated the lie he had just told. But surprisingly, Lynette simply remained quiet and allowed Rick to continue handling the situation himself. Meanwhile, Lastar looked at Rick with disbelief. He genuinely could not accept that someone as ordinary and middle-aged looking as Rick could possibly be Lynette's boyfriend. Then Lastar noticed the exam admission ticket Rick was carrying. He immediately asked whether Rick was actually one of the examinees taking the promotion exam. Rick calmly answered that he was. However, before Rick could properly explain anything further, Lastar suddenly burst into laughter. He openly mocked Rick for still being an F-rank adventurer at his age. He continued laughing while treating the entire thing like some ridiculous joke. However, Rick calmly fired back. He pointed out that despite saying all that, Lastar himself only took the exam around the age of 24 or 25. Compared to other people, that was still much slower than normal. Lastar immediately responded by proudly revealing his rank. He was currently an A-rank adventurer, and he had already reached E-rank when he was only 14 years old. The moment Rick heard that, his eyes widened in genuine surprise. Then Lastar revealed something even more important. He explained that he was also one of the examiners responsible for supervising the second exam's mock battles. That revelation shocked Rick even further. However, Lastar barely paid attention to Rick anymore afterward. Instead, he once again turned toward Lynette and casually told her to abandon the mob-looking guy beside her and simply come out to lunch with him instead. At that point, Lynette finally responded herself. She calmly stated that things were exactly as Rick had said earlier. The two of them were dating, so she could not accept Lastar's invitation. Then Lynette casually added something else. the smell of Laster's perfume was far too strong, and honestly, she found it unpleasant. Rick immediately piled onto the comment and casually remarked that he had already noticed something smelled bad earlier. He then wondered out loud if the smell was actually coming from Lastar himself. That instantly made Lastar furious. He angrily declared that a third-rate person like Rick was completely unworthy of standing beside a first-class beauty like Lynette. Then, with clear hostility in his voice, Lastar warned Rick about the second exam. If Rick ended up in the group under his supervision, then Rick had better prepare himself. Lastar swore that he would personally make Lynette realize just how completely different the positions between him and Rick truly were. After making his threat, Lastar finally turned around and walked away. Meanwhile, Rick could only sigh to himself. Once again, the situation had somehow become troublesome. More than anything else, he sincerely hoped Lastar would not end up supervising his group during the next exam. Soon afterward, the guild staff began posting the list of applicants who passed the first stage and advanced to the second exam's mock battles. Lynette explained that the board displayed the numbers of everyone who successfully passed. Then Rick immediately spotted his own number among them. The moment he realized it, Rick became genuinely happy. He excitedly celebrated the fact that he had actually made it through. Lynette calmly congratulated him on passing. However, Rick suddenly realized something while celebrating. He quickly pulled his hands away from Lynette's shoulders and immediately apologized. Then he also apologized for the earlier lie where he suddenly claimed Lynette was his girlfriend. Rick honestly believed that pretending to date an older guy like him was probably unpleasant for her. However, Lynette unexpectedly answered that, if anything, she had actually been happy about it. After saying that, Lynette casually mentioned that she needed to head off and report back to her party before leaving the area. Rick stood there completely stunned by her reaction. Then, little by little, his face turned completely red from embarrassment. Meanwhile, somewhere else inside a bar, the quiet atmosphere was suddenly shattered. People who had simply been minding their own business were startled when Lastar violently kicked a chair aside while angrily ranting about Rick. Lastar furiously referred to Rick as a less-than third-rate bastard. He continued complaining while insisting that people were born with an innate rank in life. According to him, if he ever cornered Rick somewhere like a bathroom, he would gladly pick a fight with him personally. But then, in the middle of his rant, Angelica and Frito suddenly arrived while crying dramatically. Seeing the two of them in that state, Lastar immediately asked what had happened. Frito quickly began explaining that during the first exams, he had been trying to properly show off his genius. However, some man around 40 years old had supposedly used dirty tricks to interfere with him. Angelica then added her own complaint. According to her, the same man had manipulated the conditions of their duel, and it even seemed like he had intended to take advantage of her afterward. The moment Lastar heard all of that, his expression hardened immediately. To him, such behavior was completely unforgivable. He then asked Angelica to describe the kind of man who would dare try something like that against her. Angelica described him as a middle-aged man around 40 years old who worked at the town hall. As she continued describing him, Rick's image immediately appeared inside Lastar's mind. Because of that, Lastar quickly asked Frito whether he remembered the man's exam number. Later on, Lynette escorted Rick toward the location for the next stage of the exam. As they walked, Rick quietly thought about the upcoming mock battle against an actual human opponent. More than winning or losing, the thing worrying him the most was whether he would really be able to hold back properly. He wondered whether he could actually win if he tried holding back properly. At the same time, he also worried about who would end up becoming the examiner for his group. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. Rick honestly felt like the anxiety surrounding the exam would never stop. However, Lynette calmly told him to settle down a little. Then suddenly, an unfamiliar voice called out, trying to get Rick's attention. A man politely approached him and asked whether he was Rick Gladiartle. Rick confirmed it immediately before asking whether they had met somewhere before. The man quickly apologized for the awkward introduction and admitted that he only knew Rick one-sidedly. Then he introduced himself as Lynx Lalato. Lynx explained that he would be the examiner supervising Rick's group during the second exam. The moment Rick heard that, he immediately felt overwhelming relief. More than anything else, he was simply grateful that the examiner was not Lastar. Meanwhile, Lynx casually mentioned that he had already reviewed the profiles of everyone assigned under him. However, when he saw Rick's background, he honestly doubted his own eyes. According to the documents, Rick had switched careers from being a guild receptionist to becoming an adventurer after already reaching his 30s. Hearing that instantly made Rick nervous again. Quietly, he wondered whether this was simply the same situation repeating itself all over again. Usually, once people heard about his age, they immediately started mocking him for beginning so late in life. Rick honestly hoped this would not become yet another source of stress for him. However, Lynx suddenly surprised him. Instead of mocking him, Lynx described Rick's decision as an incredible display of determination. Rick genuinely looked shocked by that response. Lynx then explained that, as another middle-aged man himself, Rick's story had honestly encouraged him. At that moment, Rick carefully looked into Lynx's eyes and realized something important. The man standing before him was not speaking sarcastically or trying to insult him indirectly. Lynx then revealed that he himself only became an adventurer at the age of 24. Even back then, he already believed he had entered the field very late compared to everyone else. Because of that, Lynx said that seeing Rick jump into the adventurer world 6 years later than even him was genuinely impressive. In his eyes, someone would only make a decision like that if they desperately wanted something badly enough to risk everything for it. Something like a dream that Rick wanted to achieve no matter the cost. Rick quietly admitted that Lynx was right. He truly did have a dream he wanted to achieve. However, Rick also became curious and asked how Lynx was able to understand that so easily. Lynx calmly explained that he understood because he himself was already in his 40s as well, yet he still continued chasing his own dreams even now. According to Lynx, in order to achieve that dream, he needed to eventually become an A-rank adventurer. He then revealed that he had already spent 20 long years working toward that goal. Even after all that time, he had only recently managed to reach B rank. However, despite how difficult the journey had been, Lynx had absolutely no intention of giving up. Then he asked Rick whether he felt the same way. At that moment, Rick quietly realized something. Lynx was exactly like him. Another middle-aged man stubbornly chasing something he cared deeply about, even while knowing society considered it inappropriate for someone their age. Because of that understanding, Rick slowly extended his arm toward Lynx and offered him a handshake. He calmly confirmed that the two of them truly were the same. The two men then firmly shook hands. Both of them genuinely looked forward to the upcoming mock battle. More importantly, Rick now understood that Lynx was the type of examiner who would never play favorites during the exam. Lynx even casually invited Rick out for a drink once the exam was over. Shortly afterward, Lynx headed toward the staircase while quietly thinking to himself. The moment they shook hands earlier, he noticed something unusual about Rick's hands. They felt rough and hardened, almost like the hands of a battle-worn martial artist who had spent years training relentlessly. Because of that realization, Lynx quietly reminded himself that he needed to work even harder from now on. However, before he could leave properly, another voice suddenly called out to him from behind. Someone mockingly referred to Lynx as a third-rate adventurer. It was Lostar. Lostar had apparently been waiting there for him already. Then, with a composed expression, he casually stated that there was something he wanted to discuss with Lynx and asked whether he currently had some free time available. According to the board displaying the mock battle assignments, Lostar Duramoto would be supervising applicants numbered 4100 through 4199, while Lynx Lalato would handle applicants numbered 4200 through 4299. After seeing that, Rick immediately felt relieved. It had been dangerously close. If his number had been off by even one digit, Lostar would have ended up becoming his examiner instead. Because of that, Rick confidently declared that he would not lose to the curse of 4242. For the first time in a while, he honestly felt like his luck might finally be turning around. However, while Rick was still checking his exam slip, a sudden announcement echoed throughout the area. The notice was directed toward examinees numbered 4200 through 4299. According to the announcement, examiner Lynx Lalato had suddenly suffered a major decline in his physical condition. Because of that, Lynx would no longer be able to supervise the exam. The moment Rick heard that, he became genuinely worried. Earlier, when they were speaking together, Lynx had looked completely fine. However, the announcement continued. Since Lynx could no longer participate, it had been decided that Lostar Duramuto, who had already supervised the previous group, would now also take charge of their group as well. The moment Rick heard that name, the drink in his mouth instantly exploded out in shock. Around him, several applicants immediately started panicking. Rick overheard people muttering that Lostar was the absolute worst possible examiner to get. Some even claimed it would be practically impossible to pass this year under him. Confused and nervous, Rick walked over to the other applicants and asked whether examiner Lostar was really that famous. One applicant immediately explained that Lostar was extremely famous. He was the firstborn son of the prestigious Duramuto household and an elite genius adventurer who achieved A rank by the age of 17. People even referred to him as the man who holds 1,000 skills, the strongest mage among the A ranks. However, according to the applicant, the real problem was the other nickname people gave him. They called him the F-rank crusher. A woman nearby then explained the reason behind the name. Every single year, Lostar specifically chose to participate in the E-rank mock battles. And whenever he noticed someone who caught his interest, he would deliberately torment them during the exam simply because he seemed to enjoy doing it. Then she warned Rick to make absolutely sure he did not attract Lostar's attention. The moment Rick heard that, despair instantly filled his face. He realized he had already attracted Lostar's attention so badly that it practically felt like the man was biting down on him with his eyes alone. Then Rick suddenly noticed two medics carrying away an injured applicant on a stretcher nearby. The injured man continued ranting angrily while being transported away. He complained that using something ridiculous like a 6th order spell during an E-rank exam was completely unfair and dirty. The moment Rick heard the words 6th order spell, panic immediately took over his face. In complete frustration, he started desperately wondering what exactly he was supposed to do now. Inside the stadium where the mock battles were taking place, Lost Tar calmly began chanting another spell. He called out for the deep green earth to freeze before activating a 4th order spell. Then, without hesitation, he unleashed Blizzard Rockshot directly toward the F-rank examinees standing before him. After witnessing the result of the attack, Lost Tar coldly judged the outcome as unacceptable. He then openly insulted the F-rank applicant, calling him nothing more than an absolutely less than third-rate bastard. Meanwhile, people watching from the audience were horrified by what they had just seen. One spectator pointed out that defending against a 4th order spell would normally require at least B-rank level defensive magic. Another person immediately added that Lost Tar clearly had no intention of letting anyone pass the exam at all. At the same time, Lost Tar continued waiting for one particular applicant to arrive. Number 4242. While thinking about Rick, Lost Tar quietly declared that he intended to make Rick experience a level of dread so overwhelming that even the depths of hell itself would feel lukewarm by comparison. However, another voice suddenly interrupted him. An elite guard approached Lost Tar, causing him to ask what exactly the man wanted. The elite guard then calmly offered to personally take care of applicant number 4242 for him, but Lost Tar immediately rejected the offer. He insisted that Rick's punishment would be carried out personally by him alone. Then he warned the guard not to interfere with his plans. The elite guard then commented that losing against Lost Tar, the strongest A-rank adventurer, would honestly not be considered particularly humiliating. Hearing that caused Lost Tar to reconsider things slightly. Then another idea suddenly crossed his mind. What if Rick never even reached the exam properly in the first place? Lost Tar thought that having Rick's pride and hard work crushed through a simple and unreasonable disqualification would probably humiliate him far more deeply. To Lost Tar, punctuality was one of the most important rules of the exam. Because of that, he believed it would be entertaining to watch Rick desperately struggle just to arrive on time. Then Lost Tar asked the elite guard if he could leave the matter entirely in his hands. The guard calmly agreed. Meanwhile, elsewhere near the waiting area, Rick and Lynette were still waiting for the next round of the exam to begin. Rick had become completely restless by this point. He repeatedly muttered to himself while anxiously wondering what exactly he was supposed to do now. Seeing his condition, Lynette asked why he was panicking so badly. Rick immediately explained that the examiner personally held a grudge against him. On top of that, the same examiner happened to be Lost Tar, the strongest A-rank adventurer. Rick desperately asked how anyone could possibly stay calm in a situation like that. However, Lynette simply told him to settle down and trust in his true strength. But Rick was already losing control of his emotions entirely. In complete despair, he started questioning what he had even done wrong in the first place. Then he desperately declared that he just wanted to go home already. However, the moment he remembered that going home would only triple the intensity of his training, Rick became even more horrified. At that point, Rick honestly started wondering whether his death had already been decided no matter what he chose. Then, out of nowhere, an unfamiliar voice suddenly called out to Rick, casually referring to him as a young fellow. Rick immediately acknowledged the voice and turned toward the speaker. The man politely asked whether Rick was one of the examinees. Then he noticed how troubled Rick looked and suggested that, if he had any concerns, he could simply talk to him about them. Rick quickly recognized the man as a fortune teller. However, Rick immediately complained that this was not really the time or place for fortune-telling. On top of that, he begged the man not to interrupt his current state of panic. However, the fortune-teller calmly pointed out that Rick was hopelessly stressed. Because of that, he offered to use magic to help calm Rick's nerves. The man also admitted that it was natural for Rick to be suspicious of him. So, as proof of goodwill, he offered to help Rick completely free of charge. After hearing that, Rick eventually agreed to try it. The fortune-teller then guided Rick toward a chair and asked him to sit down. However, there was a strange symbol carved directly into the chair itself. The moment Lynette noticed it, her eyes immediately widened in alarm. But before anyone could stop him, Rick sat down. The instant he did, his body completely vanished. Lynette was left stunned in shock. As she stared at the chair, Lynette immediately realized the symbol carved into it was actually a teleportation magic circle. Meanwhile, the fortune-tellers started laughing loudly after seeing Rick fall perfectly into the trap. Then the man finally revealed his true identity. It was Frito Diramuto all along. Frito proudly declared himself the leading male actor behind the entire setup. However, before he could continue celebrating, a violent gust of wind suddenly exploded through the room. In the next instant, the crystal nearby was sliced perfectly in half. Even the windows behind Frito shattered apart instantly from the force. Lynette had already moved. She dashed forward at terrifying speed, grabbed Frito by the collar, and lifted him straight into the air. Then she coldly demanded to know exactly where he had teleported Rick. Frito immediately tried to answer. However, before he could even finish speaking, Lynette made another terrifyingly fast movement. A sharp gust passed across Frito's face, trimming part of his eyelashes instantly. Then Lynette calmly warned him that the next thing she cut would be his eye itself. At that point, Frito became visibly terrified. Panicking, he quickly explained that teleportation magic was one of the most difficult forms of magic in existence. Even for a genius like him, the maximum range he could manage was only around 100 meters. Because of that, Rick could not have been sent very far away. Meanwhile, Rick had already appeared somewhere else entirely. The moment he regained his senses, he realized he was now outside the plaza in front of the arena. Rick quickly pieced things together and realized that the fortune teller must have teleported him somehow. However, he still could not understand the reason behind doing it, but instead of wasting time thinking about it, Rick immediately pushed the question aside and decided he needed to hurry back as quickly as possible. However, before he could move any further, another unfamiliar voice suddenly stopped him. Someone asked whether Rick was the guy Lostar had been talking about. Then a massive man slowly appeared from behind him. The giant calmly stated that he had heard Rick defeated Angelica. After that, he questioned whether Rick was really just some ordinary guy in his 40s like everyone kept saying. Naturally, Rick immediately corrected him again by insisting that he was still in his 30s. Then, all at once, several men dressed in black suddenly appeared from both behind and in front of Rick, completely surrounding him. The men calmly introduced themselves as the elite guards of the Diramuto household. One of the guards even politely apologized before informing Rick that they intended to bury him right there and then. At that moment, Rick finally connected everything together. If these people belonged to the Diramuto household, then that meant the fortune teller from earlier had definitely been Frito in disguise. Rick immediately asked the apparent leader whether their goal was simply to stop him from leaving, especially considering that his exam would begin in only 30 minutes. However, the leader calmly pointed out that Rick had already defeated Angelica. Because of that alone, they had already judged Rick to possess at least B-rank level strength. Rick quickly tried explaining that the duel only turned out that way because Angelica suddenly started feeling unwell in the middle of the fight. But the leader ignored the explanation completely. He simply stated that they were a professional combat unit. Hearing that made Rick sigh internally. From his perspective, everyone connected to the Diramuto families seemed completely incapable of listening to anything other people said. The leader then continued explaining their strength. Among the 20 elite guards gathered there, even the weakest one possessed power comparable to a B-rank adventurer. On top of that, several among them were powerful enough to rival A-rank adventurers, including the leader himself. As he spoke, the leader slowly drew his swords. The moment Rick saw the weapons, he immediately recognized the special reinforcement technique embedded into them. At that point, he realized the earlier claim about A-rank level strength had not been an exaggeration at all. Rick immediately started feeling doomed. Inside his mind, he honestly believed the situation was impossible. Earlier, fighting a single B-rank level second-class knight had already been incredibly difficult for him. Now he was suddenly surrounded by 20 elite fighters, including opponents comparable to A-ranks. Rick started wondering whether the situation had become genuinely hopeless. He had been dragged away to some completely unrelated location just so they could force him to fail the exam. At that point, Rick fully understood this was no joke anymore. Then the leader calmly ordered everyone to begin. However, at that exact moment, 3 new figures suddenly appeared nearby. One of them immediately recognized Rick and questioned what he was doing there. Another quickly noticed that Lynette was nowhere around him. The leader turned toward the newcomers in confusion, wondering who they were supposed to be. Meanwhile, Rick himself stared at the 3 figures in shock. The sudden appearance caught him so off guard that he could barely get the words out properly, because the people who had just arrived were actually his senpais.